Hi, I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to thank our opening plenary speakers for an inspiring vision for how we address the crisis in local journalism while addressing long-standing gaps in coverage of neglected communities. Now we're going to hear from path-breaking media practitioners who have built two of the most innovative nonprofit media outlets of the past decade and how they're working together going forward. Sarah Alvarez is founder and editor of Detroit-based Outlier Media, and Dick Tofel is founding general manager and departing president of ProPublica. And while Dick is retiring from ProPublica, he is still serving on the advisory board of Outlier Media, which is going to become the governing board of Outlier as it becomes a separate and independent nonprofit organization. Thanks, Dick and Sarah, for sharing your thoughts with us.
It's so Sarah, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as well. I've been thrilled that you're part of the ProPublica local reporting network. Maybe before I get to a real question for you, you could just say whatever it is that we're so far saying about what your local reporting network project is.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'm thrilled to be part of it as well. I'm reporting on energy shutoffs and electric affordability in Detroit.
Yeah, so that is a great segue. We are delighted about the growth of the ProPublica local reporting network because it allows us to extend our work into so many communities around the country. But I've been particularly delighted to be associated with Outlier because it seems to me, and it seemed to me since I first saw you at a conference, which was what? It seems like 400 years ago because it was before the pandemic, but it was really what, 3 years ago? 2 years ago?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think 3.
That a lot of what Outlier does, I think of as coming before the news in the sense that it's about information needs. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that the idea is pervasive that because information is so easily accessible on the internet, that it means that access to high quality and verified information is also ubiquitous, and it's not. In a lot of communities, in particular in lower income communities, in Black and Brown communities, people do not have the information that they need to achieve their goals and meet their challenges. They just don't have that. And until the news industry realizes that, it's going to continue to be kind of wondering why it can't get a foothold with more audience, why it can't become a more valuable part of the community. And I don't know that anybody else is going to step up to fill those information needs, right? Like there's not a profit motive really to fill basic information needs, but there is an absolute reason to do it, right? Like there is a desperate need for it to be done. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Pew Center. I've used a lot of their work in building Outlier and informing the work that I do. But in their most recent survey about local news, you know, they ask people what local news topics are either important or interesting. And the way I see that is like those two things should not even be in the same question, right? Something that a person finds interesting and something that a person finds important are completely distinct. And a lot of news is, I think, still stuck on trying to provide people things that they will find interesting. But we need to really be focused on finding the information that people need and say is deeply important to them, right?
Right, and obviously also it differs for different people who are differently situated. I mean, one of the ways I think about this, and I don't know if this makes sense to you or not, is so affordable housing policy is a really interesting subject. It's an interesting subject in New York where I live and in a lot of communities around the country. But you only get to the question of affordable housing if everybody has shelter, or at least you only get to that question for people who already have shelter, right? If you have people who are unsheltered, affordable housing is a question that's not yet on the table. Does that,
right.
does that
Yeah,
make
it
sense?
might be interesting, but you might not have time to be interested by that if you are currently looking for a place to keep your family safe and sheltered, right? And a lot of this is, I think, easily understood, and the approach of Outlier and some other news organizations, which are also great and working in this space, I think this approach is understood by that very old school Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, like kind of adapt it to be a hierarchy of information needs, right? Like you need the basics first. And then you can move up and think about like, well, what information do people want that makes them feel connected to their community? What information do people want that makes them feel, you know, self-satisfied? But you cannot get there until you have absolutely met that baseline level of this is information people need to survive before we can worry about information that people need to thrive. And I guess the other thing that I'll say is that we at Outlier are so fortunate to work in Detroit, which does have a pretty healthy local news ecosystem. And so it's easy for us to focus on those critical information needs, because we know that there are other news organizations and community organizations that are focusing on some of the other essential things that are also necessary, that community connection, right? Creation of a record, correction of a record. We don't have to do all of that because we're part of an ecosystem. And so we stay in our lane and we help support the other people who are doing those other things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that business of filling the gaps that you're well situated to fill is a crucial part of all this. So do you want to just talk for a minute about, I mean, we haven't begun publishing it, but we've done one call out, I know, that seeks information for it. So we can say a little bit about how this project, for instance, fits into this, just to give people, for instance, of, so what does this mean in real life?
That's a great idea. So what we try to do at Outlier is two things. One, we want to fill people's information gaps. And then two, we want to address and attack accountability gaps. And information gaps is the easiest thing to do. We do that through our SMS service, right? We can report that information fairly quickly and get it to people in a way that they find accessible. But information, as you know, is not always enough to address a problem. Maybe there's a larger accountability gap happening. And those resources are scarce, right? It's expensive to do that kind of reporting, as you well know. And so we want to make sure that if we're going to do watchdog reporting that's really intense or investigative reporting, that we are doing that around an issue where we've already tried to address this with information, and we've really found that there's some kind of systemic breakdown. That's the case with the electricity and the number of shutoffs and the cost of electricity in Detroit. We have found through doing these info needs surveys that we do that, you know, people say that they need help with two things and complain about two things most: housing and electric utilities. Housing information, no problem. We did that for years, right? We had a very successful information service. We did a lot of reporting around it. Electric affordability is a really tough problem. There is, you know, we cannot FOIA those investor-owned utilities very easily. We can't provide people information that says like, well, if you can't afford your bill, you can go to X community agency. X community agency doesn't have money for that person, right? And so at that point, I think a lot of newsrooms would say, there's nothing we can do. Like that's just not something that we can do. But we won't say that because this continues to be such a huge need that we have to say like, well, we have to find a way for journalism to approach this problem. And so for us, that's really investigating like why the shutoffs are so high and why the cost of electricity is so high. And that's a very, I think some people might see that as like a I don't know, not a straight up journalistic enterprise, but it really is. Like, this is investigative journalism, and it wouldn't come from a place other than Detroit, where this problem is so pervasive, and yet this company has so much influence that it's just not really looked at very critically.
Great. So more broadly, just because we've got this important audience of lots of influential people that we can have a chance to talk to, can you just give us a couple of the highlights of how Outlier is growing and the stages that it's going through right now? Because I think it'd be useful for them to hear that.
Sure. Well, it's so nice that Outlier is growing. I mean, it's incredible. I started it in 2016, and it started just as a project, right? We started with $70,000 to do all of the work that needed to be done and try to pay myself a little bit. And now we have finally gotten to a place where we have a pretty full staff. We have a managing editor. We have 2 newsletter products. You know, we have a development director coming on. And all of that is wonderful and sustained primarily by philanthropy, although we are looking at some earned revenue possibilities. But I think what is important about that is that I was happy for Outlier to be a project. I really was like, it just needs to be done, and let's try to find a way to make it last as long as possible. And then maybe we could get subsumed into a larger media entity, and that would take care of, running the model and conserve resources, which are always scarce in this industry. But Candace Fortman, who's the executive director and, is my partner in all of the work at Outlier, she and I realized, like, we can't leave the scene right now. Local media is not getting stronger. It's getting weaker, right? Like, these people are not paying more attention to information needs, they're paying less attention to information needs. Like, misinformation isn't getting better, it is getting worse. And so there has to be an organization, I think, in each local community that is really dedicated to doing that kind of work, like you say, Dick, that is like almost like pre-news. It is foundational and instrumental to having a healthy information ecosystem for somebody to do this work, and for that group of people to be journalists who are dedicated to the truth, not to anything else, right? And so we decided in 2020, which was the worst year in general, but also a terrible year to be in news, we decided to rededicate ourselves to Outlier as an organization and to really try to grow it as an organization, because we think we have to be around when one of our 2 major dailies closes. And we're trying to prepare ourselves for that day. And we're trying to help other small local newsrooms prepare themselves for that day. Because if we don't, the people that we serve and the communities that we care so much about, those folks are going to suffer.
Thank you. First of all, I would, Vince and colleagues, thank you so much for having us. I hope you have a sense from this of why it's so important, frankly, not only to the country, but to me personally, to be involved in this effort. And I'm really thrilled to be.
Well, I'm so thrilled you are too. And I have some questions for you too, Dick. I mean, you have had such an amazing career and led one of the very best news organizations in the country through such a difficult time, right? This shrinking of the news industry. When you are looking back at your time with ProPublica and ProPublica's, role, I guess, in the larger national news ecosystem, what are the lessons that you have really drawn from that? What do you think everybody needs to know about how you see that time?
Wow. I tried to write up a sort of laundry list of this for the Columbia Journalism Review a couple of months ago. And I won't be that articulate, if I was articulate at all, there on the fly. But the most important thing, I think, is what we've already said, that there are big gaps that need to be filled, that they are widening. This isn't I think you're right that this gap is widening. It's not the only one. The most troubling trend is what you were saying about metro papers, which is why I've been so delighted that ProPublica could, while maintaining its national work, get into local work increasingly as well. And that people need to find those gaps, not to duplicate the other things that other people are already doing, because the country doesn't need that, and to fill as many of them as they sustainably can.
Yeah, that is great. Do you feel like the needs changed as you were working with ProPublica? Like, do you feel like what ProPublica set out to do at first and what you felt the need was, do you feel like that changed over time, other than the local national split?
I mean, sure. I mean, you know, Trump was an enormous discontinuity, and one, you know, I hadn't expected until, you know, 7:30 that night. And then by 10 o'clock, it was reality. And things have never really been the same, right? I mean, we've been a polarized country for a long time, but the depth of it and the things about which were polarized, I think, went to a completely different level at that point. And frankly, there was a point in the afternoon of January 6th of this year where I thought, well, maybe that broke the fever, and it didn't. So that suggested that that wasn't a moment, maybe, but a much longer term problem that I think we're still really grappling with, and still trying to figure out how to grapple with, that we're going to have to wrestle with for a long time to come.
Well, that's a little bit depressing, but I do think it's totally accurate, and that's where it is, right? Like, that's our job.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
I'm so thankful for your work and for your support of us.
No, that is great. My great pleasure. Again, Vince and colleagues, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.